All right, hello and welcome to Zenkus Watch podcast. Sorry for the bit of silence at the beginning there. I was just seeing if the stream was actually streaming. This is a very boomer setup. I'm basically talking into a laptop. So please excuse the poor sound quality and the various lulls and lulls lulls in conversation. However, what we are going to do now is we're going to continue to react to an interview or actually a podcast conversation between eclectic radical Anderson Cooper and Anthony Zankis that was put up on Eclectic Radicals podcast about 3 years ago. So it was February 2021. Joe Biden had just been sworn into office. January 6th had happened. People were still very upset about that. People are still recovering from that. And Zankis is starting to come to the terms with the fact that his that Kremlin orchestrated I have to say allegedly, but his with Tara Reid had failed. He had failed. They had not neglected, but they had failed in trying to reelect Donald Trump. And Biden was now president. And they're trying to pretend that they're cool with that, but they're not. And they're going back to doing what they do best, which is sowing discord among the population because they are not getting their way. These are what KS agents do. These are essentially what I would call the dirtbag left would do. So let's go on and continue this conversation between eclectic radical Anderson Cooper and Anthony Zankis.
My aunt died in April. In another part of the family, my uncle passed away 2 days ago from COVID, and he lived in Florida. And so,
yeah, and let's also remember again, February 2021, the vaccine had only just started being distributed. Not everyone had been vaccinated yet. We were still at that phase where COVID was quite dangerous. It hadn't yet sort of evolved into a slightly less dangerous virus that was less likely to put you in the hospital. We were still at that stage where there were ICUs full of people on vents not because they had not been vaccinated, the vaccine hadn't really been available widely yet at that point, but because they had COVID and they had pre-existing conditions or they were just unlucky. And COVID was still very dangerous in a very dangerous form at that point. We still had morgues where people were stacked up in the morgues because the death rate was quite high. So yeah, everybody was seeing new relatives who had died of COVID or who had had their health permanently damaged by COVID. Again, February 2021, this is where people were at.
That's trauma for people, but the profound uncertainty of this moment, not just socially, but financially, is overwhelming. And I'll tell you, even little kids and families that don't understand finances, they're picking up on their parents' stress.
You see, it's sort of weird for me because I think the first reaction when Zankis realized that he had failed utterly with his dirtbag leftism, his first reaction was sort of to walk back to the center and actually say things that were quite true in terms of society-wide trauma, little children picking up on the stress that their parents are emitting because their parents have financial uncertainties and all that. He starts to get more crazier and more dirtbag-y later on in this podcast. But right now, he gentles his tone and starts speaking more in an understandable way, in a way that, frankly, I think he's correct in at this point because he has failed. He has failed. His extraordinary belligerence, his extraordinary delusion, his emotional and verbal abuse of everyone on Twitter who disagreed with him, even if they were sexual assault survivors. If they disagreed with him, they would get the most profound abuse from his end. That didn't work. And now it's starting to sink into his head that Biden is in the White House and he has failed. And the people who were middle of the road succeeded in getting a centrist Democrat into the White House. So he's now just trying to maybe gentle it by going back to the center and actually going back to, instead of calling everybody who may have an objection to his point of view a rape apologist, instead of doing that, he's actually starting to talk about subjects where more people can agree on. This is loading a bit.
And it's going to affect, and then workers, people depending on a check, were told you're going to get $2,000 checks if the Democrats win the Senate, if Ossoff and Warnock, if you send them to Washington. And the Georgia voters did send them to Washington, and then we got gaslit. And I'm going to tell you.
Oh yeah, remember when gaslighting was the word du jour about all over social media? Instead of saying lying, you can't say lying, you say gaslighting, and using it in a way that was completely not what the word means. People didn't even really know the meaning of the word gaslighting, but they kept on saying gaslighting. He gaslit me. She gaslit me. That gaslighting and malignant narcissist were the words du jour, the words that were really trending on social media around that time. Loading.
I work with domestic violence victims, sexual violence victims. Gaslighting is real. What Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and I'm calling them out by name, Kamala Harris is no better, Warnock and Ossoff did was gaslight people living on.
Imagine comparing domestic violence to politicians being unable to get legislation through Congress at lightning speed. I am a domestic violence survivor. I find this so grotesquely insulting. He is using his position and his background as a domestic violence, as an educator at a rape crisis center, from which, by the way, he was actually sued by another employee because he was harassing her, not sexually harassing her, but he was harassing her, and she sued him. And that case was allowed to go forward because the evidence showed that he was harassing her. And now he is, as far as I know in my research, no longer working at that rape crisis center. Now he's just an adjunct at Columbia and Adelphi University. The way he abuses his position, the way he uses trauma that overwhelmingly affects women to use that and draw such a sloppy line between domestic violence and politicians who did give us checks and COVID aid, but sometimes that legislation was delayed because we have checks and balances in our system. To use that as a metaphor, as being exactly the same as domestic violence, is utterly disgusting. But that's his modus operandi. That is how Zankus works. You wonder why I'm continuing to run this account calling him out, because of the way he exploits female trauma. He exploits female trauma, exploits female victims in this utterly disgusting way. And that is why I'm calling him out, and that is why I react to this shit.
And it is not only unacceptable, I think it is grounds for demanding that they step down. These people are enemies of the working class. They use us for votes to get power. They play with our trauma.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Look at this guy in his unshaven beard telling two senators to step down because they won an election. And then now they're just trying to get legislation through to get COVID aid to voters. Voters got a lot of COVID checks. There was eviction protection. There was supplemental income. People who had Social Security supplemental income, they received extra money. There are people who had student loans forgiven now, and there are people who had PPP loans to help them in their businesses. There was so much COVID aid dispersed, much more than the $2,000, especially if you had children. And the idea, this absolutely ridiculous idea that because two senators from Georgia got elected, and they are now trying to push that legislation to get people COVID aid, but now they have to step down because they didn't get the legislation through within the first few weeks of Congress. This was February 2021 when they had this. They were sworn in January, just a few weeks earlier. There was January 6th. Talking about collective trauma, Congress was traumatized. They had to deal with that. They had to deal with a lot of violence in the US. At that moment, at that time, people had other things to worry about than the checks that were going out. And by the way, they were already going out. The COVID aid that he's talking about, they were going out. And here he is demanding, this unshaven white guy with mental illness is demanding that two senators, Ossoff and Warnock, step down because they're not doing what he wants them to do in the time that he allows them. That they didn't fix all of society's ills in the space of 3 weeks after an unprecedented coup attempt by Trump during January 6th. I mean, can you imagine the audacity? And this extraordinary amount of buzzwords, enemies of the working class, this, that, and the other. Anyone who disagrees with him is an enemy of the working class. It doesn't matter if you are working class. It doesn't matter if you work a working class job. If you disagree with Zenkus, you are an enemy of the working class. That is how extraordinarily detached from reality he is.
So my message to AOC is, I mean that sincerely. We need to move the conversation about trauma forward. But if you don't use this as a jumping off point to, by name, call out your president, your vice president, and those 2 Georgia senators, and Bernie Sanders. Yeah. I was very sad. Listen, I love Bernie, but don't lie to me about $1,400.
Nobody lied. There are far more than $1,400 was given to many, many Americans who need it. I mean, that's ridiculous. Look at this. So let's just break this down. This is why dark bag leftists lose. They are overwhelmingly white males. I'm going to say it now. The 3 people on this podcast are white males. That includes Cooper, who identifies as non-binary, but Cooper is a biological male. They're all white males. They have grown up with white male privilege. They're demanding that Jewish senators, Ossoff, Sanders, Black senators, Warnock, Latina senators, AOC, the Black vice president, and Biden, who's like the only other white male, essentially, that they're discussing with. Well, I mean, Sanders is also white, so is Ossoff, but Biden is. But Biden is the only person whom they are addressing in this issue who does not belong to an oppressed minority group, who essentially belongs to the same group that Zenkus and Eclectic Radical and Cooper belong to, which is privileged white males. They all belong in the privileged white male. What they're doing is that they are targeting a minority majority party, the Democrats, and demanding that this party follow their rules. That's what white male dirtbag leftists do. They target Democrats who are disproportionately Black, who are disproportionately women. They target Democrats and they order those They first of all emotionally abuse them. They verbally abuse them. They say, you're hurting people, you're killing people, you're literally rape apologists, you're literally genociders, you're literally people who oppress the working class, you're literally this and that. They go through all these horrifying terms of emotional abuse. And then they demand the Democrats do what they want when the dirtbag lefts have not managed to attain any type of electoral level where their views should be listened to. Have they won elections? Have they done any of that? The only elections they have won, like with AOC or Sanders, the people who are then sent to Washington are then obliged to compromise with centrists simply to get legislation passed. That is essentially not only how Congress works, that's how the world works. It's like I can draw a hard line about my viewpoints, but if I have to go to work, I work in healthcare, and my patient, I'm a Democrat. If my patient's somebody who supports Trump, if he's lying there in bed with his MAGA cap on, I'm going to take care of him. I'm going to give him the health care that he needs. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I think he deserves. I'm going to give him what he needs. I'm going to do my job. The whole idea of being an adult and of compromising is something that people like Anthony Zenkus and Tara Reid have never grasped. They have always seen themselves as a victim. They have always seen themselves as when they refuse to compromise, they are always oppressed because, of course, they're not oppressed. People just don't want to employ individuals who are obnoxious and refuse to do the job and have put their own welfare above the welfare of the team and other people. It's ironic that these people consider themselves Marxists and socialists when they will always put their own selves above the good of the country and of society. They literally don't know what the whole definition of socialism is. Your opinion matters less than the good of society. That is literally what socialism is.
Dude, you're gaslighting. Yeah.
Oh my God, gaslighting again. I mean, we should do a shot, take a shot every time this guy says gaslighting or some other internet buzzword.
It's not the financial insecurity, it's the feeling of being shit on.
Yes, because a lot of people worked really hard on that. My close political allies are in Georgia, And way before it was even cool to talk about Warnock and Ossoff, we were on our show talking about, we got to get people registered to vote for these special elections. The Senate runoff in Georgia, this could change everything. It became cool to talk about it. And, then it was all over. And it's just, these people worked for months. So many people, so many activists and organizers gave thousands of hours to getting Warnock and Ossoff elected. Literally.
These activists that they're talking about, the far left activists, they're a very small slice of the voters that Warnock and Ossoff had to gain in a red to purple state like Georgia to win their elections. The people Warnock and Ossoff had to court were centrist Democrats. They are centrist Democrats and left-leaning Republicans. They had to move to the center. If Warnock and Ossoff went out there on the campaign trail and started reciting these very niche campaign slogans that the dirtbag leftists would approve of, like Medicare for all and universal basic income, and they would have lost their elections. Because again, the whole point of winning elections and winning campaigns is knowing that there are people who have opinions that are different from your own, and you need those people on your side. So yes, people who Warnock and Ossoff hired on their team, they would have to say, well, we need the people who are more left to be on our side. But at the same time, we may need, pro-choice like pro-life feminist, pro-choice Republicans, extremely centrist Democrats, people who are wavering, third-party voters who now are voting thinking about Biden. We need all of them on our side. There are more Democrats than Republicans, but the reason why Democrats tend to lose elections is that our coalition is quite loose, and enough of us can break away if we're upset. And cause the Republicans, who are more tightly knit, to win in sort of more of a plurality than a majority, but they will win. And the idea of remaining bitter, saying like, oh, all of my friends who are far left tried to get you to elect and we got you elected. Here's the thing. If far leftists get people elected, the Green Party would be a force to be reckoned with. It would be the Republicans and the Greens, or maybe even the Democrats and the Greens, and the Republicans would be forced out of existence down to Libertarian Party levels. But the leftists are so small compared to Democrats and mainstream centrists who, despite their own personal views, know how the world works in terms of compromise. We have jobs, we have families. We know that certain things need to be put aside to compromise and to let the world work. And consequently, Warnock and Ossoff, when they won their elections, they did so on the backs of centrists and, say, left-leaning Republicans, as well as leftists. And that's something that Cooper doesn't really grasp here, and certainly not Zankus. Well, I think Zankus grasps it on a certain level. Most of what he says is in extremely bad faith. However, what Cooper is saying is that, oh, they betrayed the leftists who helped them get elected. The fact is, they got elected not because of the leftists, but because, well, I'm repeating myself now, but they got elected because they had to get a majority in a red state, Georgia, that only turned blue very, very slightly by a margin of only four figures, I think, like 2,000, 3,000 votes. It barely turned blue in 2020. That is the electorate that Warnock and Ossoff were dealing with.
Doing the impossible, something people said could not be done. We cannot flip both of these Georgia Senate seats. Even the most optimistic predictors were saying we'll probably flip one, but not both. And we did it. We did the impossible, and they won't acknowledge it.
They did it because they appealed to centrists. They did it because the centrists got on their side, not just the leftists.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to say something though about that one, but not both, because sure, maybe on the first election, but when it became clear that there was going to be a special runoff with both of them and one other guy on the ballot and no one else, I really, really had a strong feeling they were going to both win or both lose.
Well,
Because everybody who is going to turn out to vote for Ossoff is going to vote for Warnock. And everybody who turns out to vote for Warnock is going to vote for Ossoff. nobody who votes for Warnock is going to think that David Perdue making fun of Kamala Harris's name was in any way cool.
Yeah.
And nobody who votes for Ossoff is going to want Loeffler over Warnock.
Although, I guess from a comedy standpoint, we miss Loeffler because she's the gift that keeps on giving. My God. I mean, her corruption. What?
I love how Zenkis pretends that he was always making fun of Loeffler's corruption. He never did, or I think he did one tweet that was making fun of it. But he has always been on Democrats. He's always been criticizing Democrats. His criticism of Republicans is light to non-existent. He has one job, and I believe that he's been groomed by Kremlin operatives to do this job. This one job is to make sure that Democrats are disillusioned enough that he suppresses their turnout by going to the polls. He goes and pushes this bad faith narrative that Republicans and Democrats are the same. And that was really disrupted by January 6th. That's why dirtbag leftists like Eclectic Radical and Zenkis and Cooper really hated January 6th because that blew up their entire op where they were trying to pretend that both parties were the same. January 6th showed that both parties were not the same. I mean, Eclectic Radical tries rather pathetically to downplay January 6th, but other voters were horrified, rightly so, by January 6th. The idea that two parties are the same, no, they're not. Let's go on.
It was so blatant. You know,
It was out there in the open all the time.
She literally was the richest senator from the moment she was elected, because nobody that disgustingly wealthy has run for the Senate since the Rockefellers stopped running for office.
Maybe Dan Quayle in the 90s. I don't know.
But that was Dan Quayle. That was around the same time
God, he's so goddamn old. Honestly, nobody cares about Dan Quayle anymore.
that Jay Rockefeller was still senator from West Virginia, despite having only ever been there to run for office.
Yeah. It's almost as if politicians now just go with me on this. I know it sounds crazy. It's almost as if politicians are grifters that are in it only for the money. I know. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I could just be rambling.
So
You know, I hate it when he tries to be funny. It's very clear that he's just someone who doesn't have a sense of humor because he takes himself too seriously. And I mean, politicians are crooks. That's a new one. That's a new joke. Wow, that's amazing. I don't think anyone's ever said that before. I mean, he's not someone who has a sense of humor, and it sort of shows how calcified his personality is. It just always goes towards anger and grievance, and it's been directed that way through, frankly, his very bad Twitter habits. Also, I think through people who have been manipulating him from who may be in contact with hostile foreign powers who do try to manipulate certain people, part of the media, part of social media, I should say, to turn a narrative away from a strong American democracy and more towards people distrusting American democracy and somehow thinking that American democracy can survive fascist rulers like Trump and people who believe that elections should not be if the people who you want to win don't win.
You up late because you had this revelation yesterday, and you couldn't sleep because you're just laying there going, "Oh my God."
No.
So I will say, and I am paraphrasing one of Kennedy's colleagues in his other podcast, which is currently on hiatus right now. But a very wise person once told me that everybody in the media is to some degree a grifter because you're selling yourself. And if that's not true of politics too, I don't know what it's true about.
Yeah. It takes a different kind of person. Hey, listen, I have some background in human behavior. I teach it. Okay.
You see, here he is. Here's Zankus is being smug again. He's pretending he's an expert. It's like, I have some background in human behavior. I teach it. He really is not an expert at all. He constantly sells himself as an expert, which sort of shows you how his expertise is on very shaky ground. He's not an expert at all. You can sort of tell by how he uses by how nervous he is that people may forget that people may not take him seriously about that because he knows what he says really can't be backed up by fact. And so he's sort of in a safe space here with eclectic radical and Cooper. So he sort of trusts that they will take him seriously as an expert, but at the same time, like, he's an adjunct lecturer. He's on Twitter saying the most appalling things. He has, emotional and verbal abuse towards anyone who disagrees with him, and consequently, um, it's something that he knows in his heart of hearts that he has not reached that level of expertise. Actual experts do not speak on Twitter under their real name, I should say. Well, actually, I'm going to actually roll that back. Actual experts don't speak like he does. They don't act like he does. They actually succeed in their careers. They put forward effort and make a positive change in this world, which is something that he has not done. And he knows this.
So what does that mean? I don't know. But I can tell you that these people are not like most of us. It takes a special type of narcissist. And I mean anybody.
Oh, there we go. Narcissist. We had gaslight and now we have narcissist. You see, what he does is he says, I'm an expert. I have some expertise in human behavior. And he says that smugly, as if he's like, we all know I'm a huge expert here. But he's not. And he says, I'm an expert. And then he says something rather appalling, like, these people are not like the rest of us. It takes some degree of narcissism, blah, 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 blah. He knows that's wrong. When you deliver a blanket diagnosis to people whom you have not examined, first of all, Zankus has a degree in social work, but he has not someone who can deliver a diagnosis. And it knows that only a psychiatrist can deliver something like narcissistic personality disorder, dementia, cognitive decline. These are diagnoses that you have to be a doctor to give. And yet he delivers this diagnosis up and down Twitter about Biden, about people like Kamala Harris, about this and that. This person's a narcissist. This person has dementia. This person is a sociopath. He even calls people vampires. He called Nancy Pelosi a demon. This man, Zankus, is not mentally healthy. And what he likes to do is say, I'm an expert, and then give a huge blanket statement about whole swaths of people in politics and the media. That is a sign of an unhealthy mind.
Funny, one of the things I really liked about Bernie was he kind of admitted it when he talked about it when he was running in the primary. He's like, of course I have an ego. You need to have an ego to run for president. I'm like, well, thank you for being honest, right? But these people are cut from different cloths. And a good example is Rachel Maddow. Now, I used to follow Rachel Maddow when she was on Air America, which was a radio network many years ago.
Rachel Maddow, like AOC, is a woman who is successful. And she was successful at a fairly young age. Like, AOC was in her 20s when she was elected to Congress. I think Maddow really became very famous for her talk show in her 30s. For a point of reference, Zankus is almost 60. He was in his mid to late 50s in 2021. And that hurts him. That hurts his ego. He's talking about ego. It hurts him badly when there are women out there, especially women of color or gay women, who have succeeded beyond his wildest expectations when he was given far more privilege than they were at the beginning of his adult career. And they have done far more with far less than he has. And that And he hates that. He hates that. And he tries to suppress that hate through condescension. But he really, really hates that. In fact, Biden is kind of unusual because I think he's the only person who is a white male who Biden genuinely hates. Other white males in Congress, even if they're Democrats, like Chuck Schumer, etc., Antony Blinken, he gets a few swipes in here and there, but they don't really receive the same massive amount of hate that Kamala Harris, AOC, Nancy Pelosi gets from Zankus.
I know. It's horrible to say now. I was a huge Al Franken fan once.
So was I. And you know what? Well, we could talk about him if we end up talking about the Tara Reid.
Oh, I hope we do talk about him.
Yeah.
And at 14:54, we finally get our girl's name slipped in by Zankus, Tara Reid. Oh, and he said Tara correctly. How nice. But here again, yeah, Al Franken, a white male. Well, he's also Jewish, like Sanders and Ossoff. But nevertheless, I mean, like people. I also speak as a Jewish person. I'm Ashkenazic Jews. Ashkenazic Jews are white. So yes, he's a white male. So he gets, a bit of a pass. He's not going to get the whole the flaying alive verbally that AOC gets, that Nancy Pelosi gets. If you are a white male and you're not Biden, again, Biden is unusual in this, but if you're a white male whose name is not Biden, Zankus is going to leave you alone.
And I did like him back then, even though I knew he was more centrist than me. He was good on the radio. He listened to other viewpoints.
He was really good at calling out the worst Republican bullshit.
Yeah.
He was really, really good at saying, no, those pieces of paper, those IOUs that W was talking about were T-bills. If they're just scraps of paper or IOUs, then America's billionaires are poor.
Oh, they're talking about George W. Bush in a critical manner. That's unusual. It's unusual to hear them criticize Republicans, whether it be Loeffler. But I guess the fact that she's a woman means that she had some vulnerability. But now they're talking about George W. Bush and reminding people that, hey, he's bad, which sort of goes against their modus operandi here, which is to only criticize Democrats. They only criticize Democrats from the dirtbag left perspective because they're trying to suppress Democratic voter turnout. So it is a little unusual to hear them criticize a Republican like George W. Bush.
Yeah. We'll talk about modern monetary theory in a little bit too. But listen, so yeah, I followed Rachel Maddow.
1 second. Okay. Shut up, Zankus. Okay, so I need to say something. I've been saying Anderson Cooper when I mean Kennedy Cooper. So the three men talking are Anthony Zankus, Chris Richards, who goes by Eclectic Radical. I'm going to just say Eclectic Radical, and Kennedy Cooper. Kennedy Cooper is non-binary and all of that. I was saying Anderson Cooper earlier. That was a mistake, and I apologize. Anderson Cooper has nothing to do with this crummy little podcast. Kennedy Cooper. So Kennedy Cooper, Anthony Zankus, Eclectic Radical are the three men talking.
I'll give her this. She's extremely intelligent. More so than people in the media.
She fooled me completely. And I will tell you why she fooled me completely. I read a series called Disinformation, which is about...
All right, shut up, Eclectic Radical. Yeah, look at that. Zankus made a boo-boo. He complimented a Democratic woman, Rachel Maddow. She's extremely intelligent. And then, oops, did you just compliment a woman on her intelligence? We're men here. We're dirtbag leftists. We do not ever compliment a Democratic woman for her intelligence. The best we can do is condescension, like the attitude they showed towards AOC. It's like, oh yes, she's intelligent. Fooled me completely. No. Here's Eclectic Radical reining Zankus back in. No, we don't say anything nice about women on this podcast. No. Let's just keep it down. There's Eclectic Radical reining in Zankus.
The stories that the media kills and doesn't run on given years. So every year they publish a new volume. Yeah. And it includes all these stories that nobody or almost nobody was talking about. You know who is consistently in there for talking about stories that nobody else was talking about? Rachel Maddow. Talking about stories that nobody else was talking about? Rachel Maddow.
Not anymore.
I know.
Not anymore. And that's the thing. And I remember years ago when there was an Israeli raid on an aid ship that was going to bring aid to Palestine, and I thought, let me turn on MSC and see what their take is, and they didn't even mention it. And she didn't talk about it. But right now, like, here's the problem with Rachel Maddow.
Oh, well, probably because they didn't get confirmation on that. When you get a news report from a shaky source, and that shaky source has an agenda, the major news networks are not going to run it because, first of all, they're vulnerable to being sued if they run a news story with a shaky source. And secondly, if you have a shaky source and you're seeing that the people running that news story have an agenda, whether it be anti-Israel, which is a very huge and being anti-Israel is essentially it's an industry at this point. It's an industry. It's run out of by Hezbollah, by Iran. BBC is makes their bread and butter by being anti-Israel all the time, and of course the only people who can really give their own side of the story are the Israelis. But of course the Israelis are burdened with the old anti-Semitic archetype of the Jews always lie. That. And of course, there's also the U.S. and people say, oh, the U.S. is also in the pocket of, those people. News stories, there are sort of catch and kill stories. Ronan Farrow talked about that when he talked about how National Enquirer bought the story of several women who accused Trump of sexual indiscretion and crimes. And they bought the story and then killed it. So those women couldn't tell their story to any other periodical because they had been paid for their stories. And those stories never reached the public eye until Ronan Farrow wrote his book called Catch and Kill. However, when you're dealing with a psyop that says stuff like, I have to stop using the word psyop, but when you're dealing with a sort of disinformation algorithm that's on the social media that's being powered by a lot of hostile foreign powers towards the United States, like Russia and Iran and China with TikTok, what you have to understand is that when a shaky story comes out and that story has a bad news source, so larger media platforms don't run it, the storyline is always, this story was suppressed because it scared the elites. This story wasn't run because it had no grounding in reality. It was clearly propaganda that was fake. They never say that. Instead, they say this story was suppressed. Nothing is ever debunked. It's always suppressed when it comes to Russian or Chinese social media psyops trying to get ahead of stories that they tried to put out on social media and then were debunked.
She is paid to lie to the top 20%, those that Democratic, vote blue no matter who people, about Russia. She's, going to keep talking about Donald Trump.
She never lied about Russia. She was quite true. There was a very large and extensive campaign by Putin's Russia to put Trump in office. And this was confirmed by the Mueller report. So, of course, she's not lying about that at all. But again, she is a successful woman who's a Democrat. And consequently, she will earn the wrath of these three very mediocre white males who have nothing but a podcast that got maybe 300 or 400 views. I mean, hell, I'm doing them a favor by reacting to it.
And not talk about the pain that American people are feeling. And, she's paying $30 million a year to lie. And I'll tell you, if somebody pays me $30 million, I don't know.
There we go. Oh, there we go. And see, that's where we got the crux. He's angry because nobody's paying him $30 million. Nobody's paying him $10 million. Nobody's even really interacting with his tweets at the same level that he likes. Nobody's ever, interacting with his YouTube channel. He did start up a YouTube channel, but he hasn't updated it in a few years. He hasn't started a podcast because he knows no one will listen to him. No one's going to see his articles. He wrote one article for Common Dreams. He has no peer-reviewed papers. and all these other women being successful because they worked harder than he has, and he knows this, and he hates that fact. That's what really drives him mad. Man, if I were $30 million, it's like, oh, she only gets that money because she lies, and we're only unsuccessful because we tell the truth, and people can't bear the truth. That is the crux of white male resentment. And it is the same crux as any MAGA hat, any MAGA wearing Trump supporting guy who blames the Democrats for his failures in life and refuses to take accountability. He stands at the same line. He stands on the same shore as these dirtbag leftists who yell at the women in the Democratic Party who have been given much less than they have in life and have succeeded much more. People like, yeah, like AOC. Also, people uh, people like Ilhan Omar, people who personally I don't like, but I will say that they have succeeded more in life because they have worked harder in life than these men.
Like, it's easy for me to say now that I have values, but that's a lot of money. But let me just throw this out though. They're not talking about the pain that Americans are feeling. They're not talking about how we were lied to and gaslit by a predator president.
Gaslit. Oh my gosh. And here he is with the predator president. You know, he did like pin at the top of his Twitter feed that little video he made where he slowed down and zoomed in on Joe Biden hugging a little girl to make it look like Joe Biden was committing a crime. And the way he discusses childhood sexual assault is so grotesque. It has an air of salaciousness to it. It almost appears like he's getting some kind of excitement talking about these crimes towards children, and it's quite disgusting, especially considering his job. He worked at a rape crisis center. Thank God he doesn't appear to work there anymore. He's just now a graduate. Now he works as an adjunct instructor, and all his students are adults. I'm very glad about that. Still, he teaches social work, and he teaches social work is a grueling field. People who go into social work are disproportionately women, and they're disproportionately women who want to do the right thing. So they are vulnerable to being emotionally manipulated by people like Zankas who say, if you don't do this, you're a bad person. If you don't do that, you're a horrible person. If you don't do that, you're racist. If you don't do that, you're an enemy of the working class. These are young women going into